Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 19th, 2022. For those of you who missed it, the Schiller Institute and the Executive Intelligence Review sponsored an extraordinary emergency meeting last Saturday to discuss the question of will we slide into nuclear war, or is there an alternative, an option not just to end war, but to achieve justice and decency between nations. I'll come back to this in a few moments, but the important point is that you can't say nobody's talking about alternatives. We had a number of people putting alternatives on the table, not just to war, but to how you get to real justice for humanity. Now, there's an interesting statement issued by the Russian ambassador to Washington, Anatoly Antonov, last week, in which he said the following about the developments of the shift away from the unipolar order to a transition to a better period for human history. He said, quote, "We are at the beginning of a complex and long journey of building a multipolar world," unquote. The aim of this, he said, is that, quote, "the interests of all participants should be taken into account in the future system of international relations, and that new centers of development in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East could have an equal impact on global processes, together with Russia and the United States. Our proposals," he continued, "find more and more understanding and support in various regions of the planet," unquote. He's referring, of course, to support from the so-called Global South, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has pointed out as nations of the former non-aligned movement, the anti-colonial forces on the planet. Now remember, the original anti-colonial movement was the American Revolution, the fight against the empire, the fight for a commitment to a sovereign nation that develops the capabilities for its population. Now, this is what the world has been striving for since the end of World War II, to break the imperial bounds that were placed on them in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and to achieve not just self-sufficiency, but to achieve an end to poverty, improvement in healthcare, longer lives, better education, commitment to science and technology. That's the American dream, which could be extended to the whole planet. And we see this taking root in China. We see the developments in Asia. We see new institutions shaping up, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Forum, that are looking to the United States and asking, will you work with us? Now, instead, as Antonov concluded his talks, he said, "Russophobia prevails over creativity and common sense in the West," referring, of course, to not just the war in Ukraine, the proxy war against Russia, but overall policy from the Western nations. And he said, instead of considering Russian concerns, Washington is, quote, "pushing for escalation." Now, what's the effect of this on the main allies of Washington, namely the European nations? Well, pressure is growing on the EU governments day by day. Belgium, for example, the Prime Minister of Belgium, De Croo, attacked Biden's Inflation Reduction Act for lack of solidarity within the European Union. He said, "We are stealing one another's candles while the US is taking everything away from us behind our backs. We are on the edge of deindustrialization of Europe." This is not just true of Belgium, but of many countries, including Germany and Italy and France, as you'll see in a moment. In terms of Belgium, there were more than 16,000 demonstrators on the streets in Brussels on Friday. Inflation in Belgium has hit 10.63%, and protests are targeting both inflation and energy costs. In Italy, there were demonstrations last week in 18 cities, with more to come, as unions are joining with other organizations to protest not just the cost of living increases, but the failure of the European Union to do anything about it. From France, the Banque de France predicted a sharp slowdown ahead. They said the recovery of economic growth will occur in 2024 and 25. Based on what? They don't say. Meanwhile, Macron is warning of a potential trade war between the United States and Europe. And in Great Britain, the strike wave is continuing as anger over the collapse of living standards, the collapse of the pound, and the inability of the government to do anything to address it is driving people into the streets out of desperation. The mortgage rates are impossible. People are losing their homes, and we're seeing a level of desperation in the United Kingdom that hasn't been there in recent years. Now, the sanctions on Russian oil and gas are part of this. But the other part of it is the policy of the US and the European Union, dictated by the private banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, hedge funds, and others, that have been carried out by the central banks under coordination with the Bank for International Settlements and the International Monetary Fund. What's that policy been? In the post-2008 crash aftermath, it was to bail out the speculators, not keep people in their homes. It was to move toward more deindustrialization. What was layered on top of that then was the Green New Deal, which shuts down the most efficient energy supplies and which attacks steel production, aluminum production, and so on, continues the policy of outsourcing, and at the same time attacks the idea of sovereign nations having a right to develop their own countries. Instead, the idea is to establish under the Great Reset a global central bank run by technocrats who will dictate the spending policies to each nation. Now, that's not a very popular policy. That's why they don't talk about it. They talk about instead the Inflation Reduction Act, which is nothing but a Green New Deal on steroids. That's what Biden is offering the United States and Europe. So we had quantitative easing, which was cheap credit for speculators to protect the debt-ridden corporations and banks, to bail them out. Trillions of dollars, 20-something trillion dollars after 2008 to 2010, another 20 trillion in bailouts between 2019 and 2021. And what did it give us? Inflation and more economic collapse. Now what are they saying? Well, to stop inflation, you go from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. The same people who said quantitative easing would not cause inflation are now saying quantitative tightening will not shut down economies. They don't know what they're talking about. Their only concern is to protect the bankrupt financial institutions and the unipolar order. Europe is collapsing. The US is undergoing further deindustrialization. So go back to what Ambassador Antonov said when he talked about why not move toward this new potential of cooperation between the developing sector as a whole, which is moving, with the United States and Europe. Well, that's the answer to the problem. We need that kind of cooperation. And that's what the visionary economist Lyndon LaRouche laid out through his long career, his focus on many different regional development projects, and his commitment to the idea of Franklin Roosevelt's post-World War II order based on fixed exchange rates, sovereign nation states, investment in infrastructure, and development of science and technology. That's what is embodied in Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws. That's what the idea LaRouche put forward in his 4 powers agreement of alliance between Russia, India, China, and the United States. That's what Antonov is coming back to and putting on the table today. Now, I would really encourage you to look at the seminar that was held on Saturday by the Executive Intelligence Review, because the discussion process there was not simply how do we come together to end the proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, but how do you address the cause of it, which is the economic crisis, which comes from this Anglo-American unipolar economic system of neoliberalism, of attack on sovereignty. How do we change that into a win-win situation for humanity. I'd encourage you to watch as much of that as you can. It's 4 hours, there's a lot there, a lot of speakers, but I think if you take the time, you'll find that instead of just complaining or being fearful, solutions are there. The alternative is clear, an exit ramp from the war in Ukraine, but also a superhighway of high-speed rail and interconnectedness toward a new financial system that's based on justice and the development of full creative potential of every citizen on the planet. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.